They found the children in a barn that hadn't been opened in 40 years, 17 of them, ages ranging from 4 to 19. They didn't speak, they didn't cry, and when the social workers tried to separate them, they made a sound that no human child should be able to make. The local sheriff who responded to the call quit 3 days later and never spoke about it again. The state sealed the records in 1973, but one of those children survived into adulthood, and in 2016 she finally told her story. What she said about her family, about what lived in their blood, changed everything we thought we knew about the Hollow Ridge clan. Hello everyone! Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Hollow Ridge isn't on most maps anymore. It's a stretch of backcountry in southern Appalachia, tucked between Kentucky and Virginia, where the hills fold in on themselves like secrets. The kind of place where families don't leave, where names repeat across generations, where outsiders aren't welcome and questions aren't answered. For over 200 years, the Ridge was home to one family. They called themselves the Dalhart clan, though some of the older records use different names. Dalhart, Dalhart, Dalehart. The variations don't matter. What matters is that they stayed generation after generation. They remained on that same plot of land, never marrying outside the Ridge, never attending the churches in town, never enrolling their children in schools. They were known but not understood, tolerated but not trusted. By the 1960s, most people assumed the Dalharts had died out. The main house had been abandoned for decades. The fields had gone wild. No one had seen smoke from their chimneys or lights in their windows since the end of World War II. The few locals who remembered them spoke carefully, as if the family name itself carried weight. But in June of 1968, a pair of hunters stumbled onto the old Dalhart property while tracking a wounded deer. What they found wasn't a deer, it was a barn. And inside that barn were 17 children living in conditions that defied explanation. They had no running water, no electricity, no beds. They slept on rotted hay and wore clothes stitched from burlap and animal hide. Their hair was long and matted. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, as if they'd never seen sunlight. And when the hunters approached, the children didn't run. They stood perfectly still, staring with eyes that didn't blink, didn't waver, didn't look entirely human. The hunters called the authorities. By nightfall, the property was surrounded by police, social workers, and a medical team from the county hospital. What happened over the next 72 hours was documented in reports that were later buried under judicial seal, but pieces of the story survived. Fragments, whispers, testimonies that were never meant to leave the courtroom. And they all point to the same disturbing truth. The Dalhart children were not like other children, not in behavior, not in biology, and not in what they carried inside them. The lead social worker assigned to the case was a woman named Margaret Dunn. She'd worked in child welfare for 16 years, handled cases of abuse, neglect, and abandonment across 3 counties. She thought she'd seen everything. But when she arrived at the Dalhart property on the morning of June 18, 1968, she knew immediately that something was wrong. Not just with the children, but with the land itself. In her report, one of the few documents that survived the sealing, she described the air around the barn as thick, almost resistant, like walking through water. She wrote that the silence was unnatural. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees, just the children standing in a semicircle inside the barn, watching the adults with expressions she described as aware but not present. The youngest child was a girl who appeared to be about 4 years old. The oldest was a boy who looked 19, though later medical exams would suggest he might have been much older. None of them would give their names. None of them would speak at all. Not for the first 48 hours. When the medical team tried to conduct examinations, the children resisted, not violently, but with a kind of coordinated stillness that made it impossible to proceed. They would go limp, their bodies becoming so heavy that it took 3 adults to lift a single child. Their skin was cold to the touch, even in the June heat. And their eyes, every person who came into contact with them mentioned the eyes, dark, almost black, with pupils that didn't seem to react to light. Margaret Dunn tried to separate the children for individual interviews. That's when things escalated. The moment the youngest girl was led away from the group, the others began to hum. Not a melody but a single sustained tone that vibrated through the walls of the barn. It grew louder, deeper, until it felt less like sound and more like pressure. The sheriff who was present described it as feeling like his skull was being squeezed from the inside. The girl who'd been separated collapsed, not fainted, collapsed, as if every bone in her body had turned to liquid. When they brought her back to the group, she stood up immediately, unharmed, and rejoined the circle. The humming stopped. No one tried to separate them again. Over the next 2 days, the authorities scrambled to figure out what to do. The children couldn't stay on the property. But no facility in the state was equipped to handle 17 children who refused to be separated and displayed behaviors that no one could explain. A temporary shelter was set up in an old church basement 30 mi away. The children were transported together in a single bus. They sat in complete silence for the entire ride, hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead. When they arrived, they moved as a unit, filing into the basement and arranging themselves in the same semicircle formation they'd held in the barn. And that night, the church caretaker heard them singing, not in English, not in any language he recognized. He described it as something older than words. By morning, 3 of the staff members had quit. They wouldn't say why, they just left. Dr. William Ashford was the psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the children. He was a clinical man trained at Johns Hopkins, known for his work with trauma survivors and children from extreme isolation cases. He'd evaluated feral children, victims of cult abuse, and patients with selective mutism. He approached the Dalhart children with the same methodical detachment he'd used in every other case. That detachment lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th day, he submitted a report to the state that included a single handwritten line at the bottom. These children are not suffering from psychological trauma. They are something else entirely. He refused to elaborate. 2 weeks later, he closed his private practice and moved to Oregon. He never treated children again. What Ashford witnessed during those 3 days was documented in session notes that were later classified, but portions of his observations were leaked in 1994 by a courthouse clerk who'd been digitizing old records. According to Ashford's notes, the children demonstrated abilities that defied conventional child development. They displayed perfect synchronization without verbal communication, moving, turning, even breathing in exact unison. When one child was shown an image during a private session, the others would later draw that same image without having seen it. They had no concept of individual identity. When asked their names, they would respond with the same phrase, always in unison. "We are Dalhart." When asked about their parents, they would smile, not a child's smile, but something rehearsed, something hollow, and say nothing. The most disturbing observation came during a medical examination. A nurse named Patricia Hollis was drawing blood from one of the older boys when she noticed something unusual. The blood was darker than normal, almost brown, and it coagulated within seconds of leaving the vein. More alarming was the boy's reaction. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even seem to notice the needle. But the moment his blood touched the glass vial, every other child in the building turned to face his direction. They stood simultaneously from wherever they'd been sitting, and they began to move toward him slowly, silently, as if pulled by an invisible thread. The staff locked the doors before the children could converge. But for the next 6 hours they stood pressed against those doors, palms flat against the wood, waiting. The boy, whose blood had been drawn, sat alone in the examination room, perfectly still, staring at the ceiling. When they finally reopened the doors, the children returned to their circle as if nothing had happened. The blood sample was sent to a lab in Richmond. It was lost in transit. No follow-up sample was ever taken. By late July, the state had made a decision. The children would be separated, placed in different facilities across Virginia and Kentucky. It was the only way, they reasoned, to break whatever bond held them together, to give them a chance at normal lives. Margaret Dunn opposed the decision. So did several of the medical staff, but the state moved forward anyway. On August 2nd, 1968, the children were loaded into separate vehicles and taken to different locations. That night, every facility reported the same thing. The children stopped eating, stopped moving. They sat in their assigned rooms, staring at the walls, humming that same low, resonant tone. 3 days later, 2 of the children were found dead in their beds. No cause of death could be determined. Their bodies showed no signs of trauma, no illness, no distress. They had simply stopped living. By the end of the week, 4 more had died. The state reversed its decision. The surviving children were brought back together, and the dying stopped. The state of Virginia didn't know what to do with children who died when separated and thrived when together. There was no precedent, no protocol, no legal framework for a situation that shouldn't have been possible. So they did what institutions always do when faced with the inexplicable. They buried it. In September of 1968, the remaining 11 Dart children were transferred to a private facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The place was called Riverside Manor, though there was no river nearby, and it wasn't much of a manor. It was a converted sanatorium built in the 1920s for tuberculosis patients. Abandoned in the 50s, and quietly reopened under state contract for cases that needed to disappear. The children were housed in a single wing. No other patients, no visitors. A rotating staff of nurses and caretakers who were paid well and asked not to talk about their work. The official record listed the facility as a group home for mentally disabled minors. The unofficial truth was that Riverside Manor was a holding cell for a problem the state couldn't solve and didn't want exposed. For the next 7 years, the Dalhart children lived in that facility. They aged, but not normally. Medical records show that their growth was inconsistent. Some years they'd grow several inches, other years they wouldn't grow at all. Their physical development didn't match their apparent ages. The boy who'd looked 19 when they were found still looked 19 in 1975. The youngest girl, who should have been 11 by then, still appeared to be no older than 7. Blood tests were inconclusive. Genetic testing, primitive as it was in the early 70s, showed abnormalities that the lab couldn't categorize. Their DNA contained sequences that didn't match any known human markers. One geneticist who reviewed the samples noted that certain segments resembled developmental holdovers, traits that should have been selected out of the human genome thousands of years ago. He was asked not to publish his findings. He complied. The staff at Riverside Manor reported strange occurrences. Lights would fail in the children's wing, but nowhere else in the building. Temperature drops sudden, unexplained, localized entirely to the rooms where the children slept. Objects would move, not dramatically. A cup shifted 3 inches to the left. A chair turned to face the wall. A door that had been open now closed, though no one had touched it. The children never spoke, but they communicated. Staff members described feeling watched even when the children's eyes were closed. One caretaker reported waking in the middle of the night to find all 11 children standing around her bed, silent, staring. She quit the next morning. Another reported hearing voices in the hallway, conversations in a language that sounded like English played backward. When she investigated, she found the children asleep in their beds, but the voices continued until sunrise. In 1973, the state moved to permanently seal all records related to the Dalhart case. The official reason given was to protect the privacy of minors in state custody. The real reason, according to a memo that surfaced decades later, was concern over public panic and potential legal liability should the nature of the subjects become widely known. The memo didn't elaborate on what nature meant. It didn't have to. By that point, everyone involved understood that the Dalhart children were not simply traumatized or developmentally delayed. They were something else. Something that had been living in those mountains for generations, hiding in plain sight, passing itself off as human. And now the state was responsible for it. In 1975, something changed. The children began to speak, not to the staff, not to the doctors, but to each other. Conversations in whispers, always in that same backward-sounding language that no linguist could identify. The staff tried to record it, but the audio always came out distorted, as if the sound itself resisted being captured. What they did notice was that the children had started to separate just slightly. For 7 years, they'd moved as a single unit, slept in the same room, ate at the same time, breathed in rhythm. But now, small distinctions were emerging. One boy began spending hours staring out the window. One of the girls started drawing obsessively, compulsively, filling page after page with symbols that looked almost like letters, but weren't part of any known alphabet. Another child stopped eating meat entirely and would only consume vegetables that had been grown in soil, refusing anything that came from a package or a can. It was as if they were becoming individuals, or as if whatever had been holding them together was finally loosening its grip. The staff didn't know whether this was progress or something worse. Dr. Ashford's notes had warned that separation led to death. But this wasn't forced separation. This was choice, and that raised a question no one wanted to ask. If the children were choosing to individuate, what did that mean about what they'd been before? In March of 1976, one of the older girls, estimated to be around 23, though she still looked 16, asked a nurse for her name. Not the nurse's name, her own name. It was the first time any of the children had expressed interest in individual identity. The nurse, caught off guard, looked through the intake files. There were no names. The children had been listed by number, subject 1 through subject 11. The girl stared at the nurse for a long moment, then walked away. That night, she spoke for the first time in English. She said, "We are forgetting." The nurse asked what she meant. The girl looked at her with those black, unblinking eyes and said, "We are forgetting how to be Dalart." If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. By 1978, the children had deteriorated. Not physically, but mentally. They began to display confusion, memory loss, and something the staff described as identity collapse. They would forget their own faces. One boy spent an entire day convinced he was one of the girls. Another insisted she had died years ago and that the person standing in her place was someone else. They stopped recognizing each other. The synchronization that had once defined them was gone, replaced by chaos. 2 of the children became violent, not toward the staff, but toward each other, as if they were trying to destroy something they could no longer control. They were sedated and separated into different rooms. Both of them died within 48 hours. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but their hearts had been perfectly healthy the day before. It was as if their bodies had simply given up the moment they could no longer be what they'd always been. By 1980, only 4 of the original 11 children remained alive. The state decided to close Riverside Manor. The facility was costing too much, generating too many questions, and producing no results. The surviving children were transferred to a standard group home in southwestern Virginia. They were given names: Sarah, Thomas, Rebecca, and Michael, pulled from a list of common appellations with no connection to their past. They were enrolled in a program designed to integrate developmentally delayed adults into society. It didn't work. Within 6 months, Thomas walked into the woods behind the group home and never came back. Search teams found no trace of him. Rebecca stopped speaking entirely and spent her days rocking back and forth, humming that same low tone that had haunted the staff at Riverside. She died in her sleep in 1983. Michael lasted until 1991. He lived in a supervised apartment, worked part-time at a grocery store, and by all accounts seemed almost normal until the night he walked into traffic on a highway outside Roanoke. He didn't run, didn't stumble. Witnesses said he simply stepped into the road and stood there, arms at his sides, staring at the oncoming headlights. He was killed instantly. That left Sarah, the youngest, the only one who survived. Sarah Dalhart. Though that wasn't the name she was born with, if she'd ever been given a name at all, lived longer than anyone expected. By 2016, she was in her early 50s, though she looked decades younger. She'd spent most of her adult life in assisted living facilities, group homes, and halfway houses across Virginia and West Virginia. She held jobs occasionally: dishwasher, janitor, night stock clear, always positions where she didn't have to speak much or interact with people. She was described by caseworkers as quiet, functional, and deeply alone. She had no friends, no romantic relationships, no connections to anyone. She existed on the margins of society, just present enough to avoid suspicion, just absent enough that no one noticed her. And for nearly 40 years, she never spoke about where she came from or who her family had been until 2016, when a journalist named Eric Holloway found her. Holloway had been researching a book on forgotten Appalachian communities when he came across a reference to the Dalhart children in a declassified court document. Most of the details had been redacted, but there was enough information to follow the trail. He tracked down former staff members from Riverside Manor, obtained partial medical records through Freedom of Information requests, and eventually located Sarah through a social services database. He wrote her letters for 6 months before she agreed to meet him. They met in a diner in Charleston, West Virginia on a cold afternoon in November. Holloway recorded the conversation. That recording, over 3 hours long, was never released to the public, but portions of it were transcribed and published in a limited-run article that appeared in an obscure history journal in 2017. What Sarah told him that day rewrote everything anyone thought they knew about the Dalhart clan. She told him that the children found in 1968 were not the first generation. They were not even the 10th. The Dalhart bloodline had existed in Hollow Ridge for over 200 years, but it wasn't a family in the traditional sense. It was a lineage, a continuation. She explained that her ancestors, the original Dalharts, had come to the ridge in the late 1700s, fleeing something in the old country. She didn't say where, she didn't know, but they'd brought something with them. A practice, a ritual, a way of ensuring that the family would never die out, never weaken, never be diluted by the outside world. They didn't marry outsiders because they didn't need to. They didn't reproduce the way other families did. Sarah's words, according to the transcript, were, "We were not born, we were continued." Holloway asked her to clarify. She explained that the Dalhart children were not individuals. They were extensions. When a child was needed, the family would perform a ritual. She didn't describe it in detail, but she mentioned blood, soil, and something she called the speaking, and a new child would appear, not born from a mother, not in the way normal children are born. They would simply arrive fully formed, integrated into the family consciousness. She said the children shared a single awareness, a collective mind that allowed them to function as one organism spread across multiple bodies. That's why separation killed them. It wasn't trauma or attachment. It was severance, like cutting off a limb. The body could survive, but the limb could not. And when the family consciousness began to fracture in the 1970s, when the children started to develop individual identities, it was because the lineage itself was dying. The rituals had stopped. The connection had been broken. And without it, the children were just bodies. Hollow shells trying to figure out how to be human without ever having learned. Sarah told Holloway that she was the last, the final continuation of a bloodline that had lasted centuries. She said she could still feel the others sometimes, even though they were dead. A presence in the back of her mind. Voices that weren't voices. She said she spent most of her life trying to silence them, trying to be just Sarah, just one person, just human. But it never worked because she wasn't human. Not entirely. She was the last piece of something ancient, something that had hidden in the hills for generations, pretending to be a family when it was really something else. And now, with no way to continue, no way to perform the old rituals, no way to bring forth another generation, she was waiting, waiting for the lineage to finally end, waiting for the last thread to snap. She looked at Holloway across the table in that diner and said, "When I die, it dies with me. And maybe that's for the best." Sarah Dalhart died on January 9, 2018. She was found in her apartment in Bluefield, West Virginia, sitting upright in a chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, eyes open. The coroner estimated she'd been dead for 3 days before anyone noticed. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of illness or injury. Her heart had simply stopped. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. But the coroner noted something unusual in his report. Her body showed no signs of rigor mortis, no decomposition. Even after 3 days, her skin was still soft, still cool to the touch, as if she'd died only moments before. When they tried to move her for transport, her body was impossibly heavy, just like the children in 1968. It took 4 people to lift her into the coroner's van. By the time she reached the morgue, she weighed nothing at all. Eric Holloway attended her funeral. There were 6 people there, including the priest. No family, no friends, just caseworkers, and a few curious locals who'd heard about the strange woman who never aged. She was buried in a public cemetery on the outskirts of town in an unmarked grave. Holloway stood at the edge of the plot after everyone else had left, and later wrote that he felt something shift in the air the moment the first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence, suddenly absent, like a pressure releasing. He described it as the feeling of a held breath finally exhaled. He stayed until the grave was filled, then walked back to his car. He never wrote the book he'd planned. He never published the full recording of his conversation with Sarah. In 2019, he moved to the Pacific Northwest and stopped researching Appalachian history entirely. When asked why, he would only say, "Some stories aren't meant to be told. Some things are better left buried." But the story didn't end with Sarah's death. In 2020, a surveyor working in the area that used to be Hollow Ridge reported finding the remains of the old Dalhart property. The barn where the children had been found was gone, collapsed decades ago, but the main house was still standing barely. He entered out of curiosity. Inside he found walls covered in the same symbols that one of the Dalhart children had drawn obsessively at Riverside Manor. Hundreds of them carved into the wood stretching from floor to ceiling in every room. He photographed them and sent the images to a linguist at Virginia Commonwealth University. The linguist couldn't identify the language, but she noted that the symbols followed a consistent grammatical structure, suggesting they were communicative, not decorative. She also noted that many of the symbols appeared to be instructions, directions for something, a process, a ritual. The surveyor returned to the property 2 weeks later to take more photographs. The house was gone, not collapsed, not burned, just gone. The foundation was still there, but the structure itself had vanished. No debris, no signs of demolition, just an empty clearing where a house had stood for over 200 years. There have been other reports since then. Hikers in the area have described hearing humming in the woods at night, that same low resonant tone that haunted the staff at Riverside Manor. Hunters have found circles of dead vegetation perfectly round in places where nothing should be able to kill the undergrowth so completely. In 2022, a family camping near the old Dalhart property reported seeing children in the trees at dawn, 17 of them standing perfectly still watching the campsite. The family packed up and left immediately. When they reported it to local authorities, they were told there were no children in the area, no missing persons, no camps or youth groups. The family never went back. And in 2023, a woman in Kentucky came forward claiming to be a distant relative of the Dalhart family. She said her grandmother had been born on Hollow Ridge in 1938 and had escaped as a teenager, abandoning the family and never speaking of them again. The woman said her grandmother died in 2021. But before she passed, she told her something. She said the Dalharts were not a family. They were a continuation of something older than families. Something that didn't reproduce or grow, but endured. And she said that as long as the bloodline existed, it could never truly die. It would simply wait. Wait for the right conditions, wait for the right soil, wait for someone to remember the old ways. Sarah Dalhart was supposed to be the last, the final thread in a lineage that stretched back centuries. But lineages are not bloodlines. They are not bound by genetics or birth. They are patterns. Instructions written into the world, waiting to be followed. And patterns do not die. They repeat, they resurface, they find new vessels. The state sealed the records. The witnesses stayed silent. The journalists moved on. But the land remembers. Hollow Ridge remembers. And somewhere in soil that has drunk the blood of generations, something is still waiting, not dead, not gone, just patient. Because that is what the Dalhart bloodline always was. Not human, not entirely, but something that learned to wear humanity like a mask. Generation after generation until the mask became indistinguishable from the face beneath. And when you bury something like that, you do not kill it. You only plant it deeper. The question is not whether it will return. The question is whether we will recognize it when it does, or whether, like the staff at Riverside Manor, like the authorities in 1968, like Eric Holloway standing at Sarah's grave, we will simply choose to look away, to forget, to pretend that some stories are better left buried until the day we realize that the story was never buried at all. It was simply waiting for us to stop watching so it could begin. There's a photograph that exists in the Jefferson County archives that no one talks about anymore. It shows 4 children standing in front of a farmhouse in the winter of 1975. Their eyes are hollow, their clothes are torn, and behind them, barely visible in the window, is a shape that looks almost human. The police who found them that day were ordered never to speak about what they saw inside. 2 of them quit the force within a month. One moved across the country and changed his name. The children were separated immediately, their files sealed by court order. But 30 years later, when one of them finally broke their silence, what they revealed about the Hargraves family made investigators wish they had burned that house to the ground the day they found it. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is what happened when the authorities opened the door to the Hargraves farmhouse on January 14, 1975, and why the county has tried to erase it from memory ever since. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Hargraves family had lived on the same 200 acres in rural Jefferson County since 1893 for 3 generations. They kept to themselves. The farmhouse sat nearly 4 miles from the nearest paved road, hidden behind a dense wall of pine trees that seemed to grow thicker every year, as if the forest itself wanted to swallow the property whole. Neighbors who remembered the family from the 1950s and 60s described them as peculiar but harmless. They attended church sporadically. They sold eggs and vegetables at the farmer's market in town, but they never invited anyone onto their property, never allowed visitors, never explained why their children stopped going to school after the 3rd or 4th grade. By 1974, most people in the county had forgotten the Hargraves family existed at all. The parents, Martin and Constance Hargraves, had become reclusive to the point of invisibility. They made rare trips into town for supplies, always alone, always silent, and their 4 children, ranging in age from 7 to 14, had not been seen by anyone outside the family in more than 6 years. No one questioned it. This was rural America in the 1970s. Families were private. The government stayed out of people's business. And if something dark was happening behind closed doors, well, that was between a family and God. But on the morning of January 14, 1975, a postal worker named Eugene Marsh was driving his route when he noticed something that made his blood turn cold. The mailbox at the end of the Hargraves' long gravel driveway was overflowing. Letters and packages, some postmarked from weeks earlier, were stuffed inside and spilling onto the ground. Eugene had been delivering mail for 17 years, and he knew what an overflowing mailbox meant. Either someone had died or something terrible had happened. He sat in his truck for nearly 10 minutes, debating whether to drive up that long driveway. He told investigators later that he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a primal instinct screaming at him to turn around and leave. But he didn't. He drove up that driveway, parked in front of the house, and knocked on the door. No one answered. He knocked again. Still nothing. And that's when he heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere inside the house. Rhythmic, desperate, like fingernails on wood. Eugene Marsh didn't open the door. He ran back to his truck, drove straight to the sheriff's office, and told them something was very wrong at the Hargraves farm. Sheriff Daniel Crowley dispatched 2 deputies, men named Thomas Gill and Robert Henshaw, to perform a welfare check. They arrived at the property just after noon. The house looked abandoned, the windows were covered with thick curtains that hadn't been opened in years. The front porch was rotting, and there was a smell coming from somewhere on the property that both men would later describe as sweet and rotten at the same time, like spoiled meat mixed with something chemical they couldn't identify. Deputy Gill knocked on the door and announced their presence. Nothing. He knocked again louder this time and shouted that they were coming inside. Still nothing. Heno tried the door handle. It was unlocked. The door swung open with a long grinding creak, and both men were hit with a wave of cold air that seemed to come from deep inside the house. The interior was dark. The electricity had been shut off, or maybe it had never been connected at all. They used their flashlights to navigate through the front hallway, and what they saw made them stop in their tracks. The walls were covered in writing. Thousands of words, scratched and carved and written in what looked like charcoal and dried blood. Bible verses, apologies, confessions. Some of the writing was so small and frantic that it was impossible to read, and in between the words were drawings, crude, disturbing images of figures with elongated limbs and faces that didn't look quite human. Deputy Gill later told a psychologist that the drawings reminded him of something a child would make if they were trying to draw a nightmare they couldn't fully remember. They moved deeper into the house, calling out for anyone who might be there. The scratching sound had stopped. The silence was worse. Every room they entered was filled with the same chaotic writing, the same disturbing drawings. Furniture was overturned. Plates of food, long since rotted, sat on tables. And in the kitchen they found something that made Deputy Henshaw vomit on the spot. A large metal tub, the kind used for washing clothes, filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Floating in the liquid were dozens of dead birds. Crows mostly. Their wings had been removed. Their eyes were gone. And arranged around the tub in a perfect circle were small handprints pressed into the dust on the floor. The handprints of children. The deputies were about to call for backup when they heard it. A voice small, barely a whisper coming from somewhere upstairs. Deputy Gill drew his weapon and slowly climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under his weight. The voice grew louder as he reached the second floor. It was a child's voice singing something that sounded like a nursery rhyme, but the words were wrong, twisted. He couldn't make them out clearly, but they made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. At the end of the hallway was a closed door. The singing was coming from behind it. Gill approached slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He turned it, pushed the door open, and what he saw inside that room would haunt him for the rest of his life. 4 children were huddled together in the corner of an almost empty bedroom. 3 girls and 1 boy. Their ages were difficult to determine at first because they were so malnourished, their faces gaunt and pale, their bodies small and fragile. The oldest girl, who they would later learn was 14-year-old Sarah Hargraves, was holding the youngest child in her arms, rocking back and forth. None of them reacted when the door opened. None of them looked at the deputies. They just kept staring at the wall opposite them, where something had been written in large, shaking letters. "He comes." When we sleep, Deputy Henshaw, who had followed Gill upstairs, immediately radioed for an ambulance and Child Protective Services. He approached the children slowly, speaking in a soft voice, telling them they were safe now. But when he got close enough to touch them, the oldest girl finally turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were empty, completely devoid of emotion. And in a voice that sounded decades older than her years, she said something that made both deputies freeze. She said, "You shouldn't have opened the door. Now he knows you're here." The children were removed from the house within the hour. Paramedics who arrived on the scene described their condition as severe neglect bordering on torture. They were dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in bruises and scars that appeared to be both recent and years old. The youngest child, a 7-year-old boy named Michael, had never been registered with any school or government agency. As far as official records were concerned, he didn't exist. None of the children spoke during the transport to the hospital. They didn't cry. They didn't ask questions. They just sat in silence, staring at nothing, occasionally whispering to each other in a language that didn't sound like English. The search for Martin and Constance Haravis began immediately. Every room in the house was examined, every closet, every crawl space, every corner of the property, but the parents were nowhere to be found. What investigators did find, however, was evidence of something far more disturbing than simple neglect. In the basement, accessible only through a trap door hidden beneath a rug in the kitchen, They discovered a room that had been converted into something between a chapel and a prison cell. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was stained with substances that were later confirmed to be blood, animal, and human. In the center of the room was a wooden chair with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. Scratch marks covered every surface within reach of that chair, and hanging on the wall, directly facing whoever would be sitting there, was a massive portrait. It was painted in dark, thick oils, and it depicted a figure that investigators struggled to describe in their official reports. Most said it looked like a man, but the proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, the face too smooth, with eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood in the room. Beneath the portrait was a small altar covered in melted candle wax, dead flowers, and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Martin Hargraves, and what was written inside provided the first real glimpse into what had been happening in that house for years. The entries began in 1968 and continued sporadically until just days before the children were found. The early entries were relatively normal, discussing farming, weather, and minor family matters. But by 1970, the tone had shifted dramatically. Martin wrote about visions he'd been having, about a presence he felt watching the family at night. He described hearing voices that told him his children were impure, that they needed to be cleansed through suffering and isolation. He wrote about Constance Him, about how she too had begun to see the figure in their dreams. They called it the shepherd. They believed it had chosen their family for a divine purpose. And they believed that by keeping their children locked away from the corrupting influence of the outside world, by subjecting them to what Martin called spiritual correction, they were saving their souls. The final entry in the journal was dated January 10, 1975, 4 days before the children were found. It consisted of only one sentence written in handwriting so shaky it was almost illegible. "The shepherd has asked for us, and we must go to him now." The bodies of Martin and Constance Hargraves were discovered 3 days later, nearly 2 miles from the farmhouse deep in the woods that bordered their property. They were found by a search team that had been combing the area with dogs. What made the discovery so unsettling wasn't just that they were dead, it was the way they had died and the state in which they were found. Both bodies were hanging from separate trees roughly 50 feet apart. They had clearly been dead for several days, likely since around the time of that final journal entry. But here's what made no sense to investigators. There were no ladders nearby, no stumps or rocks they could have stood on. The branches they hung from were at least 10 feet off the ground. And most disturbing of all, there were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. Their hands were positioned at their sides almost peacefully. The medical examiner who performed the autopsies stated in his report that he could find no logical explanation for how 2 people could have hanged themselves from branches that high without any means of reaching them. But there was something else? Something that was kept out of the official reports and only whispered about among the investigators who were there that day. Both bodies had been mutilated post-mortem. Their eyes had been removed with what appeared to be surgical precision and carved into their foreheads in symbols that matched some of the drawings found on the walls of the farmhouse, and were markings that a religious studies professor later identified as a bastardized combination of various occult and Christian iconography. Someone or something had performed a ritual on these bodies after they died. The investigation into the Hargraves case was quietly shut down within 6 weeks. The official cause of death was ruled as a joint suicide brought on by shared psychotic disorder. The house was seized by the county and there was talk of demolishing it, but legal implications with the property deed kept that from happening. Instead, it simply sat there empty and decaying for years. Locals avoided it. Stories spread, and the 4 Hargraves children disappeared into the foster care system. Their identities protected, their records sealed by court order. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. For nearly 3 decades, the story of the Hargraves family existed only as a dark footnote in Jefferson County history. The people who remembered it didn't talk about it. The investigators who worked the case moved on with their lives, though several admitted years later that they never really moved on at all. And the children, now scattered across different states with different names, tried to build lives out of the ruins of their childhood. But in 2004, something happened that brought the entire nightmare back into the light. Sarah Hargraves, the oldest of the 4 children, broke her silence. She was 43 years old, living under a different name in Oregon, working as a librarian, and by all outward appearances, living a normal life. But the truth, as she would later reveal in a series of interviews with the investigative journalist, was that she had never escaped that house. Not really. The memories followed her everywhere. The nightmares never stopped. And after years of therapy and countless failed attempts to move forward, she made the decision to tell the world what really happened in that farmhouse. What Sarah described was beyond anything investigators had imagined. She explained that the abuse had started gradually when she was around 8 years old in 1969. Her father had become obsessed with religious texts, but not the Bible her family had grown up reading. He had acquired books from somewhere, books with strange symbols and writings in languages she didn't recognize. He began conducting ceremonies in the basement, forcing the children to participate. He told them they were being prepared for something important, that they had been chosen. The punishment started small, hours spent kneeling in prayer, days without food for perceived sins, but they escalated quickly. Her father built that chair in the basement, the one with the leather straps, and he would force them to sit in it while he read from his books and performed what he called purification rituals. Sometimes these sessions lasted for hours. Sometimes they lasted for days. Her mother stood by and watched, occasionally participating, convinced that they were doing God's work. But here's what Sarah said that sent chills through everyone who heard it. She insisted that her parents weren't entirely wrong about something being in that house. She described a presence that she and her siblings all felt, especially at night. She said there were times when she would wake up and see a figure standing in the corner of their room, tall and impossibly thin, watching them with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. She said her siblings saw it too. They all did. And while her father claimed he was communicating with this entity, Sarah believed that whatever it was had been feeding on their suffering, growing stronger with each act of cruelty inflicted in that house. The other 3 Harav's children were eventually located by journalists following Sarah's revelations. 2 of them refused to speak publicly, but the third, Rebecca, who had been 12 years old when they were found, confirmed every detail of Sarah's account. She added that in the final months before they were rescued, their parents had become completely consumed by their belief in the shepherd. They barely ate, they barely slept. They spent almost all their time in the basement preparing for what they called the final offering. Rebecca believed that offering was supposed to be the children that their parents had been planning to kill them as some form of sacrifice. And if that postal worker hadn't noticed the overflowing mailbox, if those deputies had arrived even a week later, she was certain none of them would have survived. The public response to Sarah's revelations was immediate and intense. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Mental health professionals analyzed the case as an extreme example of folia familie, a shared psychotic disorder that can affect entire family units. Religious scholars debated whether Martin Hargraves had been influenced by legitimate occult texts or had simply created his own delusional theology. But for the people of Jefferson County, the story brought back memories they had tried to bury for 3 decades. Former Deputy Thomas Gill, now retired and living in Florida, agreed to speak about the case for the first time in 2005. He described returning to the Hargraves farmhouse multiple times in his dreams, always finding himself back in that basement, staring at that portrait on the wall. He admitted that he had requested a transfer to a different county within months of finding the children because he couldn't drive past that property without feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. He said something else too. Something that never made it into any official report. On the day they found the children after they had been taken to the hospital, he and Deputy Henshaw returned to the house to secure the scene. They went back down to the basement, and the portrait was different. He swore the figure in the painting had changed position, that it was no longer facing forward, but turned slightly as if looking toward the stairs. Henshaw saw it too. They both did. They never mentioned it to anyone because they knew how it would sound. The farmhouse itself became the subject of intense interest. Paranormal investigators requested access. True crime enthusiasts tried to locate the property. But the county had finally taken action. In 2006, after years of legal wrangling, the house was demolished. Every board, every brick, every piece of that structure was removed and incinerated. The land was sold to a development company that planned to build new homes on the site, but construction never began. Workers reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents, and an overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. The project was abandoned. The land sits empty to this day, marked only by a small historical marker that makes no mention of what happened there. It simply states that the property was once home to a family farm established in 1893. The four Harab's children have all requested privacy in the years since their story became public. Sarah passed away in 2019 from cancer. Before her death, she gave one final interview in which she was asked if she believed her parents were evil or simply mentally ill. Her answer was chilling. She said that evil and illness aren't always separate things, that sometimes evil finds people who are vulnerable and broken, and it uses them. She said she had forgiven her parents years ago because holding on to that anger was just another way that house could keep her trapped. But she also said she would never forgive whatever it was that had been in that basement watching them feeding on their pain. She said she still felt it sometimes, even decades later and thousands of miles away. A presence at the edge of her awareness, waiting, watching, patient. The case of the Hargraves family remains one of the most disturbing examples of familial abuse and shared delusion in American history. But for those who lived through it, for those who saw what was in that house, it represents something darker. A reminder that there are places where human cruelty and something unexplainable intersect. Where the line between psychological horror and something genuinely otherworldly becomes impossible to define. The children were found in 1975. They were rescued. They survived. But what they brought with them from that farmhouse, the memories and the scars and the presence that still haunts them, suggests that some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. The Hargraves family is gone. The house is gone. But on certain nights, people who live near that empty plot of land still report seeing lights moving through the trees where the farmhouse once stood. They report hearing voices, children's voices, singing something that sounds like a lullaby, but with words that make no sense, words that sound like they're calling something. In the spring of 1986, a clerk in a small North Carolina records office opened a filing cabinet that hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, buried beneath yellow papers and dust, was a birth certificate that should not have existed. The name on it belonged to a child the Barrett family swore had never been born. But the hospital stamp was real. The doctor's signature was real, and the blood type listed didn't match a single living member of the Barrett line. For 3 generations, the Barretts had been held up as proof that racial purity could be maintained, documented, and defended in America. They were studied, photographed, their family tree was published in medical journals. But that one piece of paper, hidden for 40 years, unraveled everything. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't just destroy a family. It exposed a system that had been built to erase people like ghosts. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of a bloodline that was never as pure as they claimed. This is the story of a child who was erased. And this is the story of what happens when a lie becomes law. The Barrett family of Asheville, North Carolina, wasn't just another old Southern family. They were a case study. In 1931, a team of eugenicists from the University of Virginia arrived at their sprawling estate with cameras, calipers, and notebooks. They measured skulls. They cataloged eye color. They traced the family tree back 7 generations all the way to 1763. And when they were done, they published their findings in a journal called Heredity and National Character. The conclusion was simple. The Barretts were genetically pure. Anglo-Saxon, unmixed, a model for what America could be if the right people reproduced, and the wrong people didn't. For the next 50 years, that designation followed them everywhere. The family was invited to speak at conferences. Their photographs appeared in textbooks. Local newspapers called them the first family of racial science. And the Barretts wore that label with pride. They displayed the framed journal article in their front hall like a war medal. Visitors were told the story before they even sat down for tea. This wasn't just heritage. It was proof. But there was a cost to being perfect. The family became obsessed with maintaining what they'd been told they had. Marriages were arranged with other certified families. Births were announced in the society pages, with bloodline details included. And when something didn't fit, when a child was born with features that raised questions or a relative showed signs of what they called degeneration, that person disappeared from the record. Sometimes they were sent away. Sometimes they were institutionalized, and sometimes they were simply never mentioned again. By the 1980s, only 3 Barretts remained in Asheville. An elderly brother and sister, both unmarried, and a cousin who rarely spoke to anyone. The family had preserved itself into extinction, but the story they told never wavered. They were pure. They had the papers to prove it. And no one, not even the changing world around them, could take that away until someone found the birth certificate that said otherwise. The Clear who found it wasn't looking for anything unusual. She was digitizing old records, a routine task mandated by the state to preserve documents that were crumbling with age. Most of what she scanned was mundane births, deaths, property transfers. But then she opened a folder marked Confidential, 1946, and found a birth certificate that had been filed backwards, upside down, as if someone had shoved it in quickly and hoped no one would ever look. The child's name was listed as baby girl Barrett. No first name, just those 3 words. The mother's name was Rebecca Ann Barrett. The father's name was left blank. The birth date was March 14, 1946. The delivering physician was a doctor named Howard Milliken, who had practiced in Asheville for 30 years before retiring in 1952. Everything about the document seemed legitimate, except for one thing. According to the official Barrett family genealogy, the one published and republished in dozens of sources, Rebecca Ann Barrett had never given birth. She had never even been married. The Clear made a note and moved on, but something about it stayed with her. A week later, she pulled the certificate again and looked closer. The baby's blood type was listed as AB negative, rare, very rare. She cross-referenced it with other Barrett family records on file, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records. Not a single Barrett in 7 generations had AB negative blood. Not one. She brought it to her supervisor, who brought it to the county archivist, who brought it to a local historian named Dr. Ellen Marsh. Dr. Marsh had written extensively about Asheville's old families, and she knew the Barrett story well. She'd always found it strange how little was written about Rebecca Ann Barrett, despite her appearing in early family photos. In pictures from the 1930s, Rebecca was there standing beside her brothers and sisters, smiling in a white dress. But by 1950, she was gone. No obituary, no marriage announcement, no mention of her at all. It was as if she'd been erased. Dr. Marsh requested access to hospital records from 1946. Most had been destroyed, but she found one ledger, a handwritten log kept by a night nurse that included a single entry. Barrett infant female transferred to state home. The state home was a facility for unwanted children. Most were adopted out, some were not, and once a child went in, the records were sealed permanently. Rebecca Ann Barrett was 23 years old when she disappeared from her family's life. In photographs from 1945, she looks composed, almost regal, standing in front of the Barrett estate with her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her hair is pinned back. Her posture is perfect. She looks like someone who had been taught exactly how to stand, how to smile, how to exist in a way that reflected well on the family name. But by 1947, there were no more photographs of her, no letters, no records of where she went or why she left. The family simply stopped talking about her. Dr. Marsh began searching for anything that could explain what happened. She combed through old newspaper archives, church bulletins, society pages, anything that might mention Rebecca's name. What she found was strange. In 1944, Rebecca had been engaged to a man named Jonathan Pierce, the son of another prominent Asheville family. The engagement was announced in the paper with the usual fanfare. But 6 months later, the wedding was quietly called off. No explanation was given. Jonathan Pierce married someone else a year later. Rebecca was never engaged again. Then, in the spring of 1946, right around the time the birth certificate was dated, Rebecca's name appeared in the visitor log of a private sanatorium 2 hours outside Asheville. The facility was known for treating what they called nervous disorders, a polite term for anything families wanted hidden. Women who drank too much, women who had breakdowns, women who got pregnant when they weren't supposed to. Rebecca's stay lasted 3 months. When she was discharged, the log noted she was released into the custody of her brother, William Barrett. After that, there was nothing. Dr. Marsh tracked down death records and found Rebecca's name in a registry from 1953. She had died in a state psychiatric hospital in the western part of North Carolina. Cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but the file noted she had been a resident there for 6 years. She was 30 years old. No family members were listed as next of kin. No one claimed her body. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the hospital grounds, a place where they put patients no one came back for. And in all the years that followed, not a single Barrett ever mentioned her name in public again. It was as if she had never existed at all. But the baby she gave birth to in March of 1946 was real. And that child's blood told a story the Barretts could never allow to be heard. AB-negative blood is one of the rarest types in the world. Only about 1% of the population carries it. And it doesn't just appear randomly, it follows genetic rules that are absolute. For a child to have AB-negative blood, both parents must carry specific alleles. One parent must contribute an A or B antigen, the other must contribute the opposite, and both must carry the recessive H-negative gene. It's not something that can be hidden or explained away. Blood doesn't lie. Dr. Marsh contacted a genetic genealogist named Samuel Roth, a man who specialized in tracing bloodlines through DNA and historical records. She gave him everything she had: the birth certificate, the Barrett family genealogy, the blood type, and she asked him one question. Is it possible for this child to have been a Barrett? He studied the records for 2 weeks. Then he called her back. His answer was simple. No. Not if the genealogy was accurate, not if the family was as pure as they claimed. The only way that child could have AB-negative blood was if the father wasn't who the Barretts said he was, or if Rebecca herself had a parent the family never acknowledged. Roth dug deeper. He requested archives from the eugenics study conducted in 1931. Most of the original research had been destroyed or locked away after World War II when eugenics fell out of favor in America. But he found a university library that still had copies of the unpublished field notes. And buried in those notes was something no one had ever talked about. During the initial study, one of the researchers had flagged an inconsistency. Rebecca's mother, a woman named Margaret Barrett, had a blood type that didn't quite align with the family's documented ancestry. The researcher noted it, then crossed it out. In the margin, someone had written in pencil, "Error in testing. Disregard." But it wasn't an error. Margaret Barrett's maiden name was Sullivan, Irish Catholic, working class. She had married into the Barrett family in 1920, and by all appearances, she had been accepted without question. But the blood work suggested something different. Margaret's lineage likely included ancestry that wouldn't have been considered acceptable under the racial purity standards of the time. And if that was true, then Rebecca wasn't pure either. And neither was the baby she gave birth to in 1946. The entire foundation of the Barrett family's identity was a fabrication, and they had known it all along. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The baby born in March of 1946 was never given a real name. On the birth certificate, she was simply Baby Girl Barrett. No first name, no identity, just a designation that marked her as something temporary, something that didn't need to be remembered. She was transferred to the state home for children 3 days after birth. Rebecca never held her, or if she did, there's no record of it. The child was admitted under a case number, not a name, and within 6 months she was gone from the system entirely. Dr. Marsh tried to trace what happened next. Adoption records from that era were sealed by law, and most facilities destroyed their files after 25 years. But she found a social worker who had worked at the state home in the 1970s, a woman named Dorothy Hayes, who still remembered the old filing system. Dorothy explained that children born to families like the Barretts, families with money and reputations to protect, were handled differently. They weren't put up for public adoption. They were placed privately, quietly, often with families far away who didn't ask questions. Sometimes the children were given new identities entirely. Birth certificates were amended, dates were changed, and the original records were buried so deep that even the children themselves would never know who they really were. Dorothy had kept a personal journal during her years at the state home. She wasn't supposed to, but she did it anyway because she couldn't stand the idea of these children disappearing without anyone remembering they existed. Dr. Marsh asked if she could look through it. Dorothy hesitated. Then she brought out a cardboard box filled with notebooks decades old, the pages yellowed and fragile. And there, in an entry from October of 1974, was a note about a woman who had come to the facility asking questions. The woman said she had been adopted in infancy. She had recently gained access to partial records that listed her place of birth as Asheville, North Carolina, and her birth year as 1946. She wanted to know if there was any way to find her biological mother. Dorothy had tried to help her. She searched what files still existed, but found nothing conclusive. The woman left her contact information just in case. Her name was listed as Margaret Delano. She was 28 years old, married, living in Georgia. She never came back. Dorothy assumed she had given up, moved on, accepted that some doors stay closed forever. But Dr. Marsh wrote down the name, and she decided to find out if Margaret Delano was still alive. Because if she was, then the story wasn't over. The erased child had grown up, and maybe, just maybe, she had children of her own. Children who carried the same blood, the same truth, the same secret the Barretts tried to bury. Dr. Marsh found her in 2 days. Margaret Delano was still alive. She was 60 years old, living in a quiet suburb outside Atlanta, widowed with 2 grown children. Dr. Marsh sent a letter. She explained who she was, what she had found, and asked if Margaret would be willing to talk. 3 weeks passed with no response. Dr. Marsh assumed the letter had been ignored or thrown away. But then, on a Thursday afternoon in late August of 1986, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, but there was something underneath it. Something that had been waiting a long time to be spoken. Margaret said she had always known she didn't belong to the family that raised her. She looked different. She felt different. And when she turned 18, she requested her adoption papers and found just enough information to know she had been born in Asheville to a woman whose name had been redacted. She tried to find more, but every door was locked. Every record was sealed. She eventually stopped searching because it hurt too much to keep running into walls, but she never stopped wondering. And now, after 40 years, someone was telling her the truth. Dr. Marsh told her everything about Rebecca, about the Barrett family, about the blood type that didn't match, and the eugenics study that had been built on a lie. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Dr. Marsh finished, there was a long silence. Then Margaret said something that stayed with her forever. She said, "So I was erased because I was proof they were never pure to begin with." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a conclusion she had already reached on her own. Margaret agreed to take a DNA test. So did her 2 children. The results came back 6 weeks later and confirmed what the blood type had already suggested. Margaret was a direct descendant of Rebecca Ann Barrett, and her genetic markers showed ancestry that the Barrett family had spent generations denying Irish, possibly Italian, possibly something else they never wanted to acknowledge. The purity they had built their identity on was fiction, and the child they erased had carried the evidence in her veins the entire time. The story was published in a regional history journal in 1987. A few newspapers picked it up. Some readers were outraged. Others said it didn't matter anymore, that it was old history, that everyone involved was dead or too old to care. But Margaret's daughter, a woman named Claire, read the article and decided to do something no one expected. She contacted the remaining Barretts, the elderly brother and sister still living in Asheville, and she told them who she was. She told them she existed. She told them they couldn't erase her mother a second time. They never responded. But Claire didn't need them to because the truth was already out. It was documented. It was real. And no amount of silence could make it disappear again. The Barrett family bloodline wasn't pure. It never had been. And the child they tried to erase had grown up, had children of her own, and lived a full life they were never supposed to know about. The lie died, but the truth and the people it tried to bury survived. And somewhere in North Carolina, in a records office that smells like old paper and dust, that birth certificate still exists. A reminder that some secrets don't stay hidden forever. And some bloodlines carry more than just DNA. They carry the weight of everything that was done to keep them. There's a photograph that still sits in the basement archives of Mercer County, Pennsylvania. It was taken on the morning of August 14, 1967. In it, 5 children stand barefoot on the porch of a farmhouse that hadn't been opened in 11 years. Their clothes hang loose. Their eyes don't focus on the camera. The youngest, a girl who should have been 4 years old, is holding a doll made from corn husks and what appears to be human hair. Behind them through the doorway, you can just barely make out a word carved into the wooden floor. It says, "Mother." That photograph was never released to the public. The officer who took it requested a transfer 3 weeks later and never spoke about the Ashford case again. Not to journalists, not to his wife, not even, according to his daughter, on his deathbed 50 years later. But the file still exists, and what it contains changes everything you thought you understood about family isolation and what people are capable of when the world stops watching. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Ashford family disappeared from public record in 1956. Robert and Catherine Ashford, along with their 5 children, simply stopped appearing in town. No one reported them missing because in rural Pennsylvania in the 50s, keeping to yourself wasn't unusual. It was expected. The farm was remote, tucked into a valley where the roads turned to mud every spring and froze solid every winter. Mail carriers stopped delivering after repeated requests from Robert himself, who claimed the family wanted privacy for religious reasons. Neighbors assumed they'd moved. The county assumed someone else was keeping track. And for 11 years, no one checked. No one knocked on that door. No one asked why the Ashford children never came to school, never appeared at church, never walked the 2 miles into town for supplies. It wasn't until a fire broke out in the barn in the summer of '67 that anyone came close enough to realize the family was still there. What the firefighters found that day would haunt Mercer County for generations. And it started with the children. The volunteer firefighters arrived at the Ashford property at approximately 6:43 in the morning. The barn was already fully engulfed, black smoke pouring into a sky that hadn't quite turned light yet. Chief Howard Brennan, who led the response team, later told investigators that his first concern was whether anyone was trapped inside. His second concern came when he saw the farmhouse. Every window had been covered from the inside with what looked like layers of newspaper and cloth. The front door was barred with wooden planks nailed horizontally across the frame. And standing in the overgrown grass between the barn and the house were 5 figures perfectly still, watching the fire burn. Brennan initially thought they were scarecrows. That's what he wrote in his incident report. A detail that somehow makes what happened next even more disturbing. They didn't move. They didn't cry out or run toward the firefighters for help. They just stood there in a line arranged by height, wearing clothes that appeared to be hand-sewn from flour sacks and animal hide. When Brennan approached them, he realized they were children. But something was wrong with the way they looked at him. Their faces showed no fear, no curiosity, no recognition of what was happening. The oldest, a boy who should have been 16, tilted his head slightly and asked Brennan a question that made his blood run cold. "Are you the shepherd?" the boy said. "Mother told us the shepherd would come when it was time." Brennan radioed for police backup immediately. Officer Dennis Clay arrived within 20 minutes, and together they attempted to speak with the children. None of them would answer direct questions. They spoke only in response to certain phrases, as if they'd been trained to recognize specific verbal cues. When asked their names, they remained silent. When asked where their parents were, they pointed toward the house. And when asked if they needed help, the youngest girl, who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, smiled for the first time and whispered, "We've been waiting for the fire. Mother said the fire would make us clean." Officer Clay made the decision to enter the farmhouse. What he found inside would require psychological evaluation for every first responder present. The front room had been converted into what can only be described as a shrine. Photographs covered every wall, but they weren't family photos. They were images of the children at different ages arranged in grids. Each one labeled with a date and a single word: obedience, silence, purity, sacrifice. The furniture had been removed. The floor was marked with symbols drawn in something dark that forensic teams would later identify as a mixture of ash and blood. The kitchen was worse. Officer Clay found evidence that the family had been living almost entirely without modern resources for over a decade. No electricity had been used since 1957 based on utility records. No running water. The hand pump in the yard had rusted solid. Instead, there were dozens of clay jars filled with rainwater, each one marked with careful handwriting that read, "Blessed or sanctified," along with dates spanning years. The food storage consisted primarily of preserved vegetables grown on the property, dried meat of unclear origin, and sacks of grain that showed signs of severe rationing. Investigators would later calculate that the portions allocated per person per day fell well below starvation thresholds. The children had been hungry for years, but it was the sleeping arrangements that revealed the true nature of what had happened in that house. The 5 children had been kept in a single room on the second floor. There were no beds. Instead, wooden boxes had been built into the wall, each one barely large enough for a child to lie down in, arranged vertically like compartments in a morgue. Scratches marked the inside of each box. Deep gouges in the wood where small fingers had clawed during the night. On the wall above them, painted in careful letters 3 feet high, was a message that Officer Clay would see in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The body is a prison. Sleep is practice for death. Mother is the key. The children's parents, Robert and Catherine Ashford, were found in the master bedroom on the first floor. They had been dead for at least 6 days, possibly longer, based on the state of decomposition. The room was locked from the inside. Catherine lay on the bed, her hands folded across her chest, dressed in what appeared to be a ceremonial white gown she had sewn herself. Beside her, on a small table, sat a leather journal filled with hundreds of pages of handwritten text. Robert was slumped in a chair facing the bed, a revolver in his right hand, a single bullet wound to his temple. The positioning suggested he had shot himself while watching his wife die. Though the coroner could not determine Catherine's cause of death immediately, there were no visible wounds, no signs of poison. She had simply stopped living. The journal, which would become the central piece of evidence in understanding what had happened to the Ashford family, was later analyzed by psychologists, religious scholars, and forensic linguists. What they found inside painted a picture of systematic psychological control, religious delusion, and a slow descent into what can only be called domestic captivity, orchestrated by a woman who believed she was saving her children from a corrupt world. Catherine Ashford had not been a prisoner. She had been the architect, and her husband, the document suggested, had been too terrified of her to intervene until it was far too late. The final entry in the journal, dated 6 days before the firefighters arrived, contained only 7 words: "The children are ready. The fire will come." Catherine's journal began in 1954. 2 years before the family withdrew from society completely. The early entries read like those of any rural housewife, documenting daily chores, the children's growth, concerns about money, and the farm's productivity. But somewhere around October of 1955, the tone shifts dramatically. She begins writing about dreams she's having, visions she describes as messages from something she calls the voice beyond the veil. In these dreams, she claims to see the future of her children if they remain exposed to the outside world. She sees them corrupted by television, poisoned by public schools, destroyed by the influence of other children who don't understand purity. The entries become increasingly paranoid, filled with biblical references mixed with ideas that don't appear in any recognized religious text. By January of 1956, Catherine has developed what she calls the protocol. It's a detailed system for removing her family from the contamination of modern society. She writes that she's received instructions on how to remake her children into vessels of light through isolation, discipline, and what she terms the removal of false identity. She stops using their given names in the journal. Instead, she refers to them by numbers 1 through 5. The oldest boy becomes 1. The youngest girl becomes 5. She writes that names are attachments to the old world, and attachments must be severed. Robert appears in the journal rarely, and when he does, Catherine describes him as weak and still infected with doubt. She writes that he cries at night when he thinks she's asleep, that he's asked her multiple times to reconsider, to let the children go to school, to maintain some connection with town. Her response, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, is always the same. He doesn't understand. He can't hear the voice. Only I can hear it. Only I can save them. The protocol itself is chilling in its specificity. Catherine documents every aspect of the children's new lives with scientific precision. Wake time 4:30 in the morning. Morning prayers. 2 hours of recitation. Kneeling on the wooden floor with no cushions. Breakfast. A single bowl of grain porridge. No seasoning, eaten in silence. Education. Catherine teaches them to read using only the Bible and her own journals, which she has begun calling the New Scripture. She writes that conventional education is designed to make children question their parents, question God, question the natural order. She will not allow that poison into her home. The children are taught mathematics only as it applies to measuring ingredients for preservation and calculating biblical numerology. They are taught no history except the history Catherine invents, a narrative in which the outside world has fallen into darkness and only the Ashford family remains pure. The discipline sections of the journal are nearly unreadable. Catherine describes punishments for infractions like speaking without permission, making eye contact without being addressed, or showing emotion inappropriately. The wooden boxes the children slept in weren't just beds. They were sensory deprivation chambers used as punishment for what Catherine called failures of spirit. A child who cried would spend 24 hours in their box with the door closed. A child who questioned a lesson would spend 48 hours. The longest recorded confinement was 6 days inflicted on the oldest boy, one for asking when they would be allowed to leave the property. Catherine writes that she could hear him screaming for the first 2 days, then pleading on the third and fourth, then silence. She describes this silence as breakthrough, as the moment when his false self died and his true self, his pure self, emerged. Psychologists who later reviewed the journal identified this as systematic torture designed to break identity and create complete psychological dependence. When psychologists finally began working with the Ashford children in the weeks following their discovery, they encountered something they had never seen before. In cases of severe isolation and abuse, the children could speak, but they communicated as if language itself was a forbidden tool they had only recently been granted permission to use. They answered questions with long pauses, sometimes waiting minutes before responding, as though checking with an invisible authority for permission. The oldest boy, who investigators eventually identified as Thomas Ashford, age 16, told his assigned psychologist that he remembered his real name, but had not spoken it aloud in 11 years. When asked why, he said simply, "Mother told us that names were chains that connected us to the dying world. We were being reborn as something new, something clean." The middle children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from ages 8 to 14, provided fragmented accounts of their daily existence that painted a picture of complete psychological control. They described days that blurred together without variation, without holidays, without any acknowledgement of birthdays or seasons beyond what was necessary for agricultural work. They had been taught that the outside world had ended in 1956, that a great catastrophe had destroyed all other families, and that they had survived only because Mother had heard the warning in time. They believed this completely. When shown newspapers and told that other people still existed, that towns and cities were still functioning, the children reacted with confusion and fear. One of them, a boy named Michael, 12, began sobbing and asking if Mother had lied. The psychologist present noted that this appeared to be the first time the child had ever questioned anything Catherine had told him. The youngest, a girl named Eleanor, who was 4 years old when found, had no memory of life before the protocol. She had been born in 1963, 7 years into the family's isolation, and had never left the property. She had never seen another human being besides her immediate family. When firefighters and police officers arrived that morning, she genuinely believed they were supernatural beings her mother had told her would come to transport the family to the next realm. She had no concept of a world beyond the farm. When taken to the hospital for evaluation, she screamed at the sight of electric lights, having never experienced artificial illumination. She didn't understand cars. She became hysterical when shown her reflection in a mirror, something that had been forbidden in the Ashford home. Catherine had removed all mirrors years earlier, writing in her journal that reflections encourage vanity, and vanity is the door through which demons enter. But the most disturbing testimony came from Thomas, the oldest, who had been 5 years old when the isolation began. He had memories of the before time, fragmented images of attending school, playing with other children, celebrating Christmas with extended family. He remembered his grandmother visiting the farm, bringing cookies and toys. He remembered Robert, his father, being different, laughing sometimes, taking him into town in the truck. And he remembered the change. He described it like a shadow falling over his mother's face, starting slowly and then consuming her completely. He said she stopped sleeping in 1955, that she would spend entire nights sitting at the kitchen table, writing in her journal by candlelight, whispering to herself. He remembered his father arguing with her, his voice rising, her voice staying calm and cold. He remembered the day she announced they would no longer be going to town, that the family would be going to sleep and waking up in a new world, and that they needed to forget everything they knew before. Thomas told his psychologist that he tried to resist at first. He asked questions. He cried. He begged his father to make it stop. But after months in the box, after countless hours of his mother's voice explaining that his suffering was necessary, that pain was the fire that burned away corruption. He stopped resisting. He forgot how to want anything except her approval. And then he said he forgot how to want it all. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The Ashford case should have made national headlines. 5 children held in captivity by their own mother for 11 years, subjected to psychological torture, starved, isolated, and indoctrinated into believing the world had ended. A father who either participated or was too paralyzed by fear to stop it, who ultimately took his own life rather than face what he'd allowed to happen. It had every element that would typically attract media attention, public outrage, and demands for investigation into how a family could vanish so completely without anyone noticing. But that's not what happened. Within 3 weeks of the children's discovery, Mercer County officials made a decision that still raises questions today. They sealed the case file, the photographs, the journal, the testimony from the children. All of it was classified under a provision typically reserved for cases involving minors and ongoing investigations. But there was no ongoing investigation. Robert and Catherine were dead. There were no accomplices to prosecute, no criminal trial to protect. The decision to seal the records was made according to internal memos that surfaced decades later to protect the community's reputation. Mercer County in 1967 was a place that depended on image. It was rural, religious, proud of its tight-knit communities and family values. The idea that a family could disappear for over a decade, that neighbors could fail to notice, that churches could lose track of their members, that schools could not follow up on children who never enrolled, all of it reflected poorly on the very systems the county held up as proof of its moral foundation. The Ashford case was an embarrassment. Worse, it was a mirror. It forced uncomfortable questions about how many other families might be suffering behind closed doors, how many children might be hidden in plain sight, how many warning signs had been ignored in the name of respecting privacy and minding one's own business. So instead of transparency, the county chose silence. The local newspaper, the Mercer Gazette, ran a single brief story about a fire at an abandoned farm and the discovery of minors in need of services. No names were mentioned. No details were provided. The article was buried on page 7. The 5 Ashford children were placed into foster care separately. County officials decided that keeping them together would prevent them from integrating into normal society, that they needed to be apart in order to heal. This decision, made without input from child psychologists or trauma specialists, would have devastating consequences. Thomas, the oldest, was placed with a family 3 counties away. Within 6 months, he ran away twice, both times trying to return to the farm. On his 3rd attempt, he made it back to the property, which had been sold at auction to a developer. He broke into the remains of the farmhouse and locked himself in the room where the wooden boxes had been. Police found him 2 days later, unconscious from dehydration, curled inside one of the boxes that hadn't yet been demolished. He told the officers who removed him that he felt safe there, that it was the only place that made sense anymore. He was institutionalized shortly after and would spend most of his adult life in and out of psychiatric facilities. The younger children fed only slightly better. 2 of them eventually adapted to foster families and went on to live relatively normal lives, though both changed their names legally as adults and refused to discuss their childhood with anyone, including their own spouses and children. The 3rd middle child, Michael, who had asked if mother had lied, never recovered from the psychological fracture of learning. His entire reality had been false. He struggled with paranoia, believing that every authority figure was trying to deceive him the way Catherine had. He died by suicide in 1983 at the age of 28. Eleanor, the youngest, who had been only 4 when discovered, was adopted by a family in Ohio who knew nothing of her background. She grew up believing she had been orphaned in a house here. It wasn't until she was 31 years old, going through adoption records to find medical history information, that she learned the truth. According to a letter she wrote to a journalist years later, the revelation destroyed her sense of identity. She had spent her entire life believing she knew who she was, where she came from, only to discover that her earliest years had been something out of a nightmare she couldn't remember. She wrote that sometimes she wished she had never found out. That ignorance had been a mercy. The Ashford farmhouse was demolished in 1968. The developer who purchased the property claimed he had plans to subdivide the land and build new homes, but construction never began. Workers who were hired to clear the site reported unusual occurrences, tools going missing, strange sounds coming from the woods surrounding the property, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. 3 separate contractors refused to continue work, citing personal reasons they wouldn't elaborate on. Eventually, the developer abandoned the project and sold the land at a loss. It sat empty for decades, slowly being reclaimed by forest until it was purchased by the state in 2004 and converted into protected wetland. No marker exists to indicate what happened there. No historical plaque, no memorial for the children who suffered. The county made sure of that. Catherine Ashford's journal, the most complete record of what happened inside that house, remains sealed in a county archive that requires special permission to access. Researchers who have applied for access report being denied without explanation, or being granted only limited viewing under strict supervision with no photography or copying allowed. The few excerpts that have leaked over the years suggest the journal contains far more disturbing material than has ever been publicly acknowledged. References to rituals Catherine performed on the children, experiments she conducted to test their obedience, and detailed descriptions of what she believed would happen when the final fire came. That last part is particularly haunting given that the barn fire that led to the children's discovery was ruled arson. Investigators determined it had been set deliberately from the inside using accelerants that had been stored and prepared in advance. Catherine had written about fire as a purification tool throughout her journal. The working theory, never officially confirmed, is that she had planned for the entire property to burn with the family inside. A final act of purification that would transport them all to whatever afterlife she had convinced herself awaited. Robert's suicide and Catherine's unexplained death may have disrupted that plan, leaving the children alive to witness the fire she had promised, but not to die in it as she had intended. The question that haunts everyone who learns about the Ashford case is the simplest and the most impossible to answer. How did no one know? 11 years, 4,015 days. The family had friends before the isolation began. Catherine had sisters who lived within 50 miles. Robert had co-workers from his job at the grain mill, a job he quit in 1956 with no explanation. They said they assumed someone else was checking. They said the Ashfords had always been private and privacy was respected in rural communities. They said it wasn't their place to interfere with how another family lived. They said they didn't want to seem nosy or judgmental. One former neighbor interviewed in 1992 said something that captures the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this case. We all knew something felt wrong, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Nobody wanted to believe that something that bad could be happening right down the road. The Ashford children, those who survived, are in their 60s and 70s now. Most have never spoken publicly about what happened to them. The few interviews that exist are fragmentary, painful, filled with long silences and careful words. They describe a feeling of being trapped between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. The world Catherine created for them was a nightmare. But it was all they knew, and having it ripped away left them adrift in a reality that felt equally incomprehensible and threatening. Thomas Ashford, who spent decades in psychiatric care, gave one recorded interview before his death in 2009. He was asked what he remembered most about his mother. He was quiet for almost a full minute before answering. She believed she was saving us. He said, "That's the part I can't reconcile. She wasn't trying to hurt us. In her mind, everything she did was love. That's what makes it so much worse. Because how do you heal from someone who destroyed you while believing they were giving you salvation?" The interviewer asked if he ever forgave her. Thomas looked directly into the camera and said, "Forgiveness implies she was capable of understanding what she did wrong. She wasn't. She died believing she was right. So, what exactly am I forgiving?" The file sits in that basement archive still. The photographs, the journal, the testimony, all of it waiting for someone with enough clearance and enough stomach to go through it again. The Ashford case remains one of the most extreme examples of familial captivity and psychological abuse in American history. Yet, it's largely unknown outside of Pennsylvania. The county succeeded in burying it, in protecting its reputation at the expense of truth. But stories like this don't disappear just because they're hidden. They seep into the land, into the collective memory of a place, into the silence that falls when certain roads are mentioned or certain family names come up in conversation. The people of Mercer County know. They've always known. They just decided collectively and quietly that some things are better left in the dark. But you know now too. And maybe that's enough. Maybe bearing witness to what happened to those 5 children, speaking their truth even when their own community wouldn't, is the only justice left to offer. The Ashford family's children were found in 1967. What happened next was a second betrayal, one committed not by their parents, but by every person who chose to look.